a huge conversation, but I look forward to shedding some light on what might be coming up, and that's very much thanks to three brilliant speakers who are with me today. My name is Michelle Meinecke, and I'm the Director of the Energy Transition Dialogues at Gulf Intelligence, and I'd like to ask each of our speakers, before we delve into that main topic of net zero, just to look at the main stories of the day and say why they're important. Why should we care, essentially? So first up, Ali Zeroli, hope I got that right, Ali, sorry. Director of Cooperation and International Development at Mazen. Which story grabs you, please?
I think I will go with the G7 leaders commit to net zero by 2050. So it's very satisfying, and I congratulate all these leaders that are bringing their support again toward the net zero carbon in 2050. And merely it's a new support for the COP26, which will take place in UK this year, and is also a support to all the wonderful work that the United Nations are doing through the high-level dialogue this year, and which aims to also determine what are all the structuring and the main actions that should be taken in order to achieve this net zero carbon.
I think as well, what it really does is it ramps up that level of ambition. So every single major step that's done, the next step is expected to be bigger, expected to be more accountable, expected to be more impressive. And doing that in the lead up to COP26 is very meaningful, as you said, and it puts pressure on certain points. For example, the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism that Europe's looking at, starts raising very pressing questions on if others in the G7 selectively, of course, will be more willing to look at that closely as we move into COP26, which some are expecting to happen. So it just builds and builds on that momentum, which is, as you say, is very reassuring. Thank you very much. Thierry Leperc, he's the president and co-founder of DH2 Energy. Thank you very much for joining us. And which story grabs you?
You won't be surprised that I'll be picking GCC to become a green hydrogen powerhouse. Because, you know, there are two things about climate and the rest. There's talk and there's action. And talk has been very abundant in the last 6 years since Paris, and I would call that hot air, because nothing has been done. I mean, politicians can talk. The good news is that now we have industry moving seriously into what is an absolute game changer, which is very clearly how you get to net zero is by exiting fossil fuels. People have to realize that net zero means zero fossil fuels. When? Now. So when you have the GCC, which obviously is wedded to fossil fuels, which is waking up to the absolute emergency to find something alternative and to find it big and to find it now. That is a great message which is sent to the world.
And to say zero fossil fuels as well by 2050, the impact that has on, like you say, the industry that's already very established has been for just around 100 years, huge amounts of established infrastructure as well. And the risk of stranded assets is soaring. And you're looking at trillions of US dollars in stranded assets at the moment, let alone as we push ahead. And a huge part of that conversation, as we're seeing in Europe with its 40,000 kilometers of gas, LNG and gas pipeline infrastructure being made hydrogen ready in the next couple of decades as well. We'll have to start seeing more and more of that. And I think it'll be very interesting to see what the Middle East does with its established infrastructure as part of this big hydrogen push, which I'd like to touch on again later as well. Thank you very much. Robin Mills, CEO of Renewable Energy, thank you for joining us. Which story is jumping out at you in neon lights?
Thanks, Michelle. I think I'd like to pick one and Sanders perhaps a slightly cautionary note. I was struck by the one about the clean energy drive causing mineral prices to rise. And I think this for me is a reminder, you know, I'm sure we'll cover this in this session a bit later. There are many, many challenges to achieving net zero by 2050 or even by some later date. You know, we should not be unaware of what a colossal challenge this is on so many levels in terms of the amount of renewable energy, electric vehicles, hydrogen batteries, you know, everything else that has to be deployed to make this a reality. And just one subset of this is the supply of minerals. You know, we've seen a surge recently in the price of things like copper, critical minerals, which will be required for the energy transition. We hear plenty about rare earth metals. We hear plenty about lithium. There are other materials as well, which are required in huge quantities. And this is just one small subset. Those minerals have to be processed. They then have to be made into the various low carbon energy systems. And there are going to be many bottlenecks along this process. And I think this is one thing that we need to be aware of and thinking ahead of. How do we anticipate these bottlenecks and prepare for them and overcome them? And if we get into periods at which there are bottlenecks in the supply chain and renewable energy deployment or clean energy deployment is slowing down because of that, or the cost of it is rising at certain points, how do we get through that?
Well, these price fluctuations are in the environmental markets, and as they develop as well as price markets are going to certainly happen due to those sorts of issues as along that supply chain. It's something that it hasn't been looked at very much because at the moment it's just so very theoretical. But it's an interesting point you just touched on there as well. I had a conversation on this earlier this week, and it was to do with the CSR and the ESG element of minerals. And the fact, exactly as you just touched upon, that the demand is going to be rising. Some of that's going to be from more vulnerable parts of the globe. And how does that fit into those two companies' buckets, IOCs and NOCs, the ESG and the CSR, which are very much becoming merged anyway. And that in itself is a potential trouble spot for the net zero side as well, on the edge of your minerals point there. Right, so let's crack on with the main topic of today, which frankly I think we've started already. I'd just like to start on the hydrogen side, and I'd just be keen to get your view on this, Thierry. So of course, many investors at the moment are still seeing hydrogen, especially green hydrogen, as more of a high risk investment, and this isn't helpful, obviously, considering the financial sums needed to spur the R&D from theory to pilot, as you just spoke about, the talk into action, and these projects need to be scalable as well. So how would you like to see the market in the Middle East progress in the next 6 to 12 months? Because we're looking very near term here. What would you think needs to be done to get this to start getting walking the walk?
The first thing to understand is that we're just about to go to the tipping point of competitive green hydrogen. That is the essence. When green hydrogen becomes competitive with fossil fuels, it's a commodity play. It's no longer a climate or a policy play. It's a commodity play with very big volumes. We have, with my company, brought together what is the largest hydrogen consortium on the planet, which is called HyDeal, brings together 40 companies stemming from solar development, electrolysis, engineering, gas TSOs, major off-takers in steel, power and chemicals, infrastructure funds, investors, and with an objective of 67 gigawatts of electrolyzers and 3.6 million tons delivered by 2030. And that's based in Europe, from Spain and Portugal, based on one very simple principle. We need to deliver that at 1.5 euro per kilogram, which is the price, the competitive price. Now, to answer your question on investors, think about today, would you want to be an investor in fossil fuels?
No.
That's financial suicide. And very quick suicide, very quick. So you don't want to do that. Do you want to invest in variable renewables? No way. I mean, I was discussing with my good friend Laszlo Varro, who's the chief economist of the IEA just a couple of days ago. He was telling me, Thierry, what is the value of Australian solar today in South Australia? It's negative on wholesale power prices. It is negative. Do you want to put your money into something that is negative? So you want
that in itself is concerning, considering the IEA expects solar to be the biggest generator of energy by mid-century.
Sure. So the only way to make that happen is to turn that very unvaluable electron into a very valuable molecule that can be stored not for hours, but for months. And that is the key thing. You want to establish energy security. Now, imagine that a hydrogen, we're working right now for 500 megawatt sized projects in Spain, 25 gigawatt sized projects in Tunisia and other places. We're talking about installations producing hydrogen from solar electrolysis, we're talking, that will deliver the equivalent of oil and gas, except that it's going to be zero carbon, it's going to be storable for months, it's going to be competitive, and it's going to be there for as long as you can see, millions of years.
So is it a case of education that, because we're talking about very much the hurdles to getting to net zero and making these plans as you're detailing, which are full of promise, and really the relief valve on the pressure cooker that's heating up. Is it education? Is it faith? Is it just a step too far for investors right now who are recovering from the economic crisis last year, who are already having to deal with the energy transition? It's just a step too far, a bit too different.
What we are about to see is the market. The solution is the market. Let's keep the politicians where they are. The US grew by 1 Saudi Arabia in shale gas and oil in 10 years, and that was not done in Washington. Washington had nothing to do with it. It was done by entrepreneurs in the Permian Basin. It was done by technology companies. It was done by money from Wall Street. This is exactly what we're about to see in green hydrogen. Let's keep governments where they are in talking in conferences. And what we're doing right now is building the biggest hub. So Hydel is a vision. Now we're implementing that vision for a steel maker in northern Spain, which will use 200,000 tons of hydrogen in 2025 to replace coke and coal in the production of 4 million tons of steel. And by the way, this will not require precious metals. One very important thing: solar,
as Robin just
based
mentioned,
on polysilicon, which is the largest mineral on planet Earth, 38% of the Earth's crust. Steel is what we need for electrolyzers.
Ali, what do you? Sorry, Thierry, what do you think of this, Ali? From your point of view, obviously, in the area that you specialize in, the company where the company specializes, what's your view on this next push into green hydrogen?
Well,
it's the race to. Sorry, Tom. Oh, sorry.
No, please go ahead, Chair.
No, Ali, please go ahead, Ali. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Ali, please go ahead.
I completely agree with all what Thierry said, except one thing. I think that politicians need to have something to do. I agree that today it's the market perspective which will drive the development of green hydrogen, and the fact that we will really shift from fossil fuels to green energy as a whole. But I think that the incentives and the dynamic that could push the politician is really important in making this disruption real. And with Europe that is committing to 80 gigawatts of green hydrogen, 40 gigawatts from the internal market and 40 gigawatts to be imported from the neighborhood, I think that is one of the examples that will accelerate this dynamic, and that will help to drop down or to decrease the cost. But because what is the situation now? It's not anymore a subject or an item of R&D, because the technology is here and the technology is mature. It's the issue of having at scale projects and a global dynamic that will push toward the optimization of the final kilogram of green hydrogen. And in order to optimize that, we need to optimize globally 2 sets of the whole value chain. We need to continue to optimize the renewable energy set, which is the production of green electricity. And we need to optimize the set of electrolyzer and all the related infrastructure. And we need to keep in mind that green electricity contributes to over around 60 to 70% of the total cost of the green hydrogen, while electrolyzers and related infrastructure contribute to 30 to 40%. So it's thanks to this political push and dynamic that we can really change the market and add more competitiveness for the green hydrogen.
It's about having those regulatory goalposts, and there's this classic chicken and egg. The financiers don't want to get involved until they have some regulatory support or some confidence that that they're going to get that backing and it's going to move in that direction, and there are going to be national targets and goals to support them. And at the same time, the government wants to know that the financiers are going to support them if they do that. So it's a chicken egg situation really, and as you say, it does need to be a holistic effort, which sounds like it's pushing ahead with. Robin, just before we go to the first survey question, I'd be really keen to hear your thoughts on what you see as a top 2 or 3. There are hundreds, thousands, but the top 2 or 3 in your mind trouble spots when it comes to achieving net zero. You mentioned a couple when I asked you about the story. Would you be able to pin those down for me, please?
Yes, look, I think the really big challenge here is it's just the sheer scale of it and the sheer pace of deployment that's required. You know, even for technologies that have become highly competitive like solar PV, the pace of deployment is still below what we need. And the IEA report, you know, there are other reports along similar lines, spells it out pretty clearly. And you know, we hear Thierry mentioning that, you know, solar is going in Australia is going to a zero or negative wholesale pricing. You know, there are all kind of these market bottlenecks as well about accommodating these enormous amounts of variable renewables, whether that's with batteries or hydrogen or however else that is accommodated. That is a huge challenge, you know, physically, logistically, in terms of the amount of stuff that has to be built, in terms of the development of markets and the right policies and regulatory schemes to go along with it, and what kind of market structure. You know, we're coming into this with a 20th century, a late 20th century electricity market structure that has to adapt to a completely different situation from what it was designed for. And I think you see most major renewable markets, whether you talk about Europe or parts of the US or elsewhere, are still struggling with how do they properly accommodate an electricity system that's dominated by variable renewables plus different kinds of storage. So those are, I think, are really just the challenges, the scale of it. Just read the IRA report and think about physically what does this mean.
Well, yes, it can be mind-blowing if you start going into each of those forecasts, and the fact that it's coming from the IEA's mouth as well, and all the associations that brings with it as well. Do you see you're talking then about market complexity and applying arguably archaic mindsets to what is going to be a futuristic market? How do you see digital working into that? So blockchain, for example, do you see that being valuable and helping markets build this accountability, especially when it comes to carbon credits and the risk of double counting? Do you see that being important in the net zero progress?
Yeah, look, I think there's a few different issues there. I think the digital side in terms of demand response in the electricity sector are extremely important. We're not, so at the moment, Texas right now is going through yet another electricity crisis, getting very close to maxing out on capacity, and they're tweeting at people, asking them to reduce their consumption. I mean, that's not an effective way of managing that situation.
For the world's biggest economy, no.
Right. So, you know, there obviously needs to be a much more integrated and digitalized method to control demand effectively, so people are still getting the energy services they need at the right time, but in such a way that it's dealing effectively with the supply-demand balance and the supply of variable renewables and other generating resources. So that is one key area, and a very large area.
Well, just before you finish up, we'll just bring up that survey question, just because we keep mentioning the IEA report. I'm keen to know if you think, all of you, if you think big oil is going to make significant changes in the second half of this year after the IEA's recent report. So it's a net zero report, and obviously we've seen huge, we're just talking about it now, just potentially big ramifications from that. Major steps: halting the sale of new internal combustion engine passenger cars by 2035, phasing out all unabated coal and oil power plants by 2040. These are being echoed by other reports out there, and these are forecasts and recommendations. Obviously, this is not fact, but especially on the back of ExxonMobil and Shell's news in the last 2 to 3 weeks, big oil is getting quite a big hit. So I'd just like your answers, yes or no, on that. And we'll look at the answers from all the participants in a minute or so. Terry, what's your opinion on that, please? And how it feeds into net zero and accelerating it?
Oil companies, you're talking about oil companies, right? How they...
Yeah.
As you rightly said, there are trillions of dollars of stranded assets. And the lesson is that you're much better off, these are sunk costs and you need to go past them. And anybody that says, I'm going to stick with that because it still generates some cash flows is just actually not going to go well. I mean, it's not going to go well.
Going to say we are live.
We need to, these companies need to know that the issue is a system. And what we have today is a very light-hearted approach to the energy transition, which is to say, it's a piecemeal approach. I'm going to do some solar here, some wind there, and so no obvious concern about the basic issue on energy, which is the so-called energy trilemma, which is energy security. First, and foremost. How do you keep lights on? I mean, this whole electrification drive is bullshit. You're not going to do ensure permanent energy security with variable wind and solar. That will not happen, or batteries. That will never happen. Never in 100 years. People who are saying are delusional. The other thing that you want to do is to be cost competitive. I'm extremely worried when I see hundreds of hydrogen projects in Europe coming with hundreds of billions of subsidy requirements. People haven't got it. They need to be competitive. So if you're an oil and gas company, you should think upstream, midstream, downstream. You know what? Like oil. You should think scale like oil. You should think competitiveness like oil. You should think market like oil. You should think private financing like oil. Be an oil company. I mean, those people who want to convert into tree huggers and take the bad habits of irresponsible, subsidized renewable energy players are going the wrong way. So my message to the oil company, be the oil company, but with a zero carbon molecule, because the carbon-based molecule is like poison. It's going to kill you. So take the poison out very quickly.
And as you say, in your view, that's not possible to achieve net zero anyway. Ali, what's your opinion on these subsidies in the renewable market? Do you feel as well that we should be very concerned? I personally do. I think there is a reason for it to help incentivize investment and essentially a bit of mollycoddling along the way, but ultimately it's a really dangerous crutch. What do you think, Ali?
Having subsidies or feed-in tariffs in the renewable energy market is not a sustainable approach. We need a long-term approach. We need the market to find its balance, and we need the off-takers and the producers to find their interests and their economical benefits. So I think that today, for renewable electricity, the market has found already that renewable electricity is even more competitive as for electricity produced coal or from other sources for now. So the dilemma or the Manichaean question between fossil fuels and renewable energy is not anymore available.
No, that threshold is long past indeed, yes. Yeah.
While for green hydrogen, the question is still there. So I think that we don't need subsidies, but we need some incentives from governments in order to push this dynamic and to transform the whole economical paradigm in the favor of green hydrogen.
So government-led, more carrots like government-led financing and contract for differences and that sort of
thing. Etc. More incentives, removals of some taxes, etc. And some regulatory incentives like the cost of carbon that needs to be higher. It's like this that we will push during 5 or 10 years the development of more power plants to produce green hydrogen, and we will help to change or to accelerate the change of the market.
Let's see the answers to that first survey question, please, before we pop on to the next one. Oh, very interesting. Robin, are you surprised by that answer? I would have thought it'd be a lot bigger on agree, but perhaps that's overly optimistic. What do you think?
Oh, I'm not particularly surprised. And look, I answered yes, but I'm not saying the two are linked. I'm not saying that the big oil companies read the IEA report and think, oh yes, here's the answer, we have to change. I think, look, they've already been on this journey for quite a while. to differing
degrees. It's more of an acceleration. Do you see that, against that backdrop as well of Shell and ExxonMobil, and those are just two, there are many other indicators out there in the last 2 to 3 months as well, and they've been accelerating. Do you think that squeeze into the corner is just intensifying, even for some of the most proactive IOCs and NOCs?
Look, I think Exxon, Eni, Shell, BP, Equinor, they all have their own energy models and the forecasts, and many of which they publish, which of course vary significantly, right? But they're all aware of the net zero commitments that have been made. The IEA report. I mean, look, how do you get to net zero? Well, you've got to decarbonize all the bits of the economy. A bit more nuclear, a bit less nuclear, a bit more carbon capture, a bit more hydrogen. There's different ways to do it. But I mean, in the end, the tools that we have are known, and beyond that, it's a question of the maths and how do you make everything add up. And there's only so many degrees of freedom on this. So I don't think the big oil companies needed to read the IEA report. I think what's significant about the IEA report was putting it out very publicly and influencing others, influencing investors, influencing governments, other people who have influence over markets and influence over the oil companies.
Exactly.
And you saw this in the ExxonMobil shareholder vote. The European oil companies have been well ahead of the Americans on decarbonisation policies, but now the Americans are realising, because of shareholder pressure, they are going to have to come up with decarbonisation plans as well. So that's really the influence that I see, and I think that influence is getting stronger, and that's why in the second half of the year we will see the big international oil companies come out with more plans or more detailed plans that lay out their decarbonisation aims and their ways of getting there in a bit more detail. So I think, yes, the second half of the year we'll see that, but not because they necessarily feel a need to take the IEA's specific recommendations on board.
But their wider world that reads of that report and reads the news of all the other major indicators, as well as you just said, does feed back into those boardrooms and feeds back into that pressure pool to accelerate and repair or strengthen that reputational side of things as well. Let's bring in the second survey question, please. We'll do this as a rapid one. We haven't got long left. What impact does a lack of net zero targets in the Arab Gulf have on climate investors' confidence? So this is a regional question. None other climate targets are enough. They've got ambitious national visions, and plenty other different ministries have internal targets as well. They've been very public about them, and these are not new. These have been on the cards for several years now. It risks drawing unwanted scrutiny. We're talking about net zero. You've got the world's biggest economies having net zero targets, US, China, and many others. And it starts to question, does the historical epicenter of fuel and fossil fuels in general need to up its game a lot? Reputational damage lies ahead, especially in the lead up to COP26. Are those net zero targets going to be coming anytime soon? Terry, what's your opinion on this, please?
I think we've had enough with targets. What we need is industrial initiatives. So I know
it's that walking rather than talking that you mentioned at the beginning.
Government comes and say you are committing to this or that. I come from a country that is the king of making promises and never holding on. France has broken every single promise on renewables, carbon, etc. is made in the last 15 years. And you know what? It's okay, because it's just bullshit. So what we need is to go to actual action, industry moving, investors moving, and this is where the GCC has an opportunity, but massive. And today, what I see is interesting announcements in Saudi and some other countries. It just needs to be 50 times bigger and to happen now. And by the way, the IEA, and I was discussing with Laszlo Varro, is saying what the game changer in the IEA report is not the 2050 roadmap, is the first decade.
Definitely.
Read the report. The first decade is what it is about. The first decade is now.
That we're very much within, and if this progress isn't made, then the compound impact going along won't happen either. And you touched it there as well on the scalability factor, which Robin was mentioning as well, is this huge pressure. What about you, Ali? Do you agree? Which one would you go with?
Well, it reminds me the slogan of Arena: less power plants and less power points and more power plants. Let's go toward more actions. And globally, I agree. And maybe the most important is, as I said before, to have at scale projects. And we know that today we don't have power plants that are producing green hydrogen that are over 100 megawatts, for example. And we need that kind of project in order to open the path and to initiate the dynamic. And this is what Morocco, for example, is doing. We are currently working on a first reference project with an electrolyzer that will be around 100 megawatt. And we are looking to many others projects in Morocco in order to position Morocco as a hub for green hydrogen and green electricity. We are also working with 4 European countries to set up a binding agreement that should be signed in the next week to integrate our renewable electricity markets. So these are the kind of dynamics that could make the disruption that I mentioned before, and that could accelerate this energy transition. I would like just to add something in the IEA report. What is lacked for me is that there is no distinction between developed countries and developing countries. We need to keep in mind that Africa is—
Which is incredible, considering that the developing and developed countries narrative has been going on for decades. And for that to be overlooked is quite astonishing.
Exactly. So Africa is emitting around 800 millions of tons of carbon, which doesn't represent more than 1.5% in the global emission. And if we talk, for example, about developing countries, as we are talking about developed countries who are the most responsible of the gas emission, we will not be realistic or pragmatic, and we will not figure out the right solutions. So we need to push more the developed countries to really shift to renewable energy, who are becoming more competitive. And this is the point. It's not for me a point of energy transition to save the climate. It's today, the solution is when the renewable, the green energy will become more competitive than the fossil energy. And
that's what Thierry was saying. It's a market function, isn't it, rather than a political.
Exactly. This is why I totally agree with what Mark, Thierry, and Robin were saying. It's an issue today of market bankability and perspective, and we are there today. So we will
and it's also critical to do that because we already have 1 billion people worldwide without, and that's the minimum estimate, obviously, without reliable access to power, and having these targets and not fully representing or reflecting the developed versus developing nations and reflecting those figures as you were just talking about really risks worsening the energy security of people in developing countries and the financial outlook as well. It can potentially be a weakener rather than a strengthener, and it really does need to be the latter. We're running out of time, so I'd just like to bring up that survey question and see the answer, please. Okay, interesting. So Thierry and Ali said no, basically net zero targets don't really matter for the Middle East. Obviously the projects in the region do speak for themselves, and increasingly so, and it's the same for North Africa. And 56% say actually, no, you need a net zero target. That is the way of the world. Robin, just before we wrap up, last minute over to you. Can I have your thoughts, please?
Yeah, look, I think to be honest, it doesn't make much difference right now, but I think it will make a difference. And it's not so much about the target, but it's about concrete actions. But by having a target that is meant to align the whole of the government and the major state companies in actually delivering that. So there needs to be that framework and that commitment. Yeah, at the moment it doesn't make much difference, but it will, and you will see a sharp distinction, I think, between the Gulf countries, those that are doing something serious about decarbonisation, even though there's a very long road to go, and those that haven't even woken up to it as an issue. You will see that starts making a difference in terms of their access to export markets, access to finance, attractiveness to international investors. Yeah, I think you'll see that some of them will not be investable unless they are not making commitments and having Paris goals that are reasonably ambitious and actually living up to them in terms of real activities.
And truly delivering on them. Robin, thank you very much. Thank you, Thierry, and thank you, Ali. That's been a very interesting conversation. We've reached the end, and many thanks, and hope to see you again soon.
you.
Thank